And I'm not boasting, because I think any state that accomplished it would be proud of it, but I use it as an example of what a state can do. And it really requires state-level leadership from your Board of Education, from your governor, from your state legislators. So Massachusetts, no state had ever been #1 in every grade tested, in every category tested on the nation's report card. It's called NAEP. And in 2005, in 2007, in 2009, and 2011, Massachusetts ran the table every single time that test was administered. And it was this commitment to the classical literature and the high quality mathematics and science that took us there. But in a way, dovetailing back to the lessons of the Nation at Risk in 1983, Massachusetts tested as an individual country in 2007 and 2011 against South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan and the like. And Massachusetts 8th graders did what no one thought could have been possible even 20 years earlier, which is our 8th graders tested and were tied for #1 in the world in science. So the results, whether it's by almost every measure of domestic comparison or whether it's the handful of international measures we have in math and science, Massachusetts has been #1. That's sort of the good news. The bad news is that in 2007 and 2008, the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, as I mentioned, with a lot of money from the Gates Foundation, about $150 million, decided that to remedy the problems in education, we needed to have national standards. Then in 2009, they worked in conjunction really with the with the Obama administration on what they called the Race to the Top, which was a $4.3 billion grant that states had to compete for in order to get their own money back. But all the items that were on the contest were things that were preferred by the Obama administration and by the work that had already been done by the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. So, consequently, an enormous number of states began to have some discussion. It was a small and kind of muted discussion about what they needed to do to conform to the Race to the Top. So, given that Massachusetts was the highest performing, they always had to have Massachusetts on the trophy case so that all the other states would fall into line. Pioneer Institute had been very active in the 20 previous years on charter schools and education reform, so we thought that someone actually should take a look at what the academic quality of these standards are. So we enlisted Sandra Stotsky and Zev Werman, who's a Silicon Valley engineer who'd done some work on the mathematics standards in California, and Jim Milgram, who's a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. And what they did these painstaking analyses of 40 to 50 pages of sort of technical comparisons between high standard states like Massachusetts, Indiana, Texas, California, etc., against Common Core. And what they found in these exhaustive and detailed papers was that Common Core was of lower academic quality in both English and math at every step of the way. Specifically, what they did is that they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and decided to cut classic literature in a state like Massachusetts by about 60%. And Sandy can talk to you a little bit more about what they decided to fill it in with. But it's an enormous effort to really ignore the facts and evidence and research and data that has proven to be so successful for Massachusetts. On the math side, they decided to, again, ignore not only Massachusetts, but also the most competitive countries in the world, and decided to push back Algebra 1 preparation, not for 8th grade, but they decided to push it back for 9th or maybe into early 10th grade. So that's on the academic quality side. But for decades, the advocates of national standards and been kicking around Washington, D.C., and people across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservative, everyone in the K-12 education policy world has always known what I said at the beginning, which is that standards and testing and curriculum are really the interest and the control, under the legal control of states. It's the federal government, in fact, is forbidden to do it. So we enlisted a guy named Kent Talbert, who is the general counsel in the second Bush administration in the U.S. Department of Education, and his deputy general counsel, Bob Eitel, to look at these legal statutes. I mean, someone ought to take a look at the law to see whether this is actually the public officials that are actually obeying the law. And what they found and is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from advancing, directing, validating, or funding national standards, testing, and curriculum. So what Common Core is doing, and the way in which states signed on to this, is a violation of 3 federal laws. And some of the people that are in favor of Common Core say, oh, it's people on the fringe or people who are malcontents of some sort. These are the people that are bringing these points. But about a year and a half or so ago, our research was cited in a column by George Will, who's a syndicated columnist that I think most people know, and he reaches about 30 million readers every week. And so finally, given the fact that the states and localities are going to be paying for the implementation of Common Core, we thought that somebody around the conversation actually ought to find out what it's going to cost. So we initiated a study by a guy named Ted Barber. He had been a Capitol Hill staffer. He was the kind of guy that was in the budget negotiations when former President Clinton and former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich and former Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole were hashing out the small 10% of federal funding that go to K-12 education. And so Ted and his team, which included people that had worked in the U.S. Department of Education, both under the first Bush administration, but also the Clinton administration, so Republicans and Democrats looking at these analyses. What they determined is that it's going to cost taxpayers across the country about $16 billion to implement Common Core. Again, all of that will be paid for by the state and local governments. The federal government will not be helping anyone out on that. For a state like Massachusetts, my state, it's going to be about $360 million. So Massachusetts had already spent $100 billion with a B to implement this very successful education reform effort, and now they had to spend another $360 million to implement lower quality standards. For New Hampshire, it's about $100 million, so you should consider yourself lucky. But the big cost drivers are brand new professional development for all the teachers in the system. So no matter what you spent a year or even 2 years ago for professional development, that funding is wiped out, and you have to spend more money to get all the teachers up to speed on these new standards. All new textbooks, same thing. If you bought your textbooks just a couple years ago, they're obsolete under Common Core. You have to buy all new textbooks. And then the biggest cost driver is the multi-year technology cost, because all of the testing will be done online. And that's particularly true of the Smarter Balance testing consortia that you folks are part of, which was directly funded by the U.S. Department of Education. So at this point, where does it stand? Well, most state legislatures across the country were never even consulted in any of this. There's a handful that passed bills adopting Common Core and these national testing regimes that will go with Common Core, but most of them were not. And I have to tell you, considering that they're going to be paying for it, many of them are not very happy about it. So which is why you're seeing Utah and Alabama and Oklahoma and Georgia over the last year or so start pulling out of the national testing. You're seeing Indiana and Michigan and a handful of others either put a financial freeze on Common Core or put pauses on it. Just in the last couple weeks, the governor of Maine, who was a supporter of Common Core, had just passed an executive order, really starting to get on the defense now about some of the issues around Common Core, and I heard even just this evening that the governor of Florida is going to follow suit. So the thing that's been interesting, and we've been working in about 20 states, is this is really a mom and parent-driven effort. When we've spoken in front of audiences of 5 people or 900 people, it has always been primarily moms that have been driving this conversation. And so with that, I want to thank you again for your interest. It's a complicated topic. You are really fortunate to have some of the best people in the country to listen to here on it. So I appreciate your attention, and thanks.
Crop TV.